Chapter 3. I first met Carol at one of the occasions for which Mama was famous. Afterward, I never could remember whether it was a birthday, a wedding anniversary, a new baby. Mama could make a party out of anything. Willem introduced him as a friend from Leiden, and he shook hands with us one by one. I took that long, strong hand, looked up into those deep brown eyes, and fell irretrievably in love. As soon as everyone had coffee, I sat down just to gaze at him. He seemed quite unaware of me, but that was only natural. I was a child of 14, while he and Willem were already university men sprouting straggly beards and breathing out cigar smoke with their conversation. It was enough, I felt, to be in the same room with Carol. As for being unnoticed, I was thoroughly used to that. Nolly was the one boys noticed, though, like so many pretty girls, she seemed not to care. When a boy asked for a lock of hair, the standard method in those days of declaring passion, she would pull a few strands from the ancient gray carpet in our bedroom, tie them with a sentimental blue ribbon, and make me the messenger. The carpet was quite threadbare by now, the school full of broken hearts. We sat on the edge of Willem's bed, gulping down the precious bun. I suspected that to buy it, Willem had had to go without lunch. I, on the other hand, fell in love with each boy in my class in turn, in a kind of hopeless, regular rhythm. But since I was not pretty and far too bashful to express my feelings, a whole generation of boys was growing up unaware of the girl in seat 32. Carol, though, I thought as I watched him spooning sugar into his cup, was different. I was going to love Carol forever. It was 2 years before I saw Carol again. That was the winter, 1908, that Nolly and I made a trip to the university at Leiden to pay Willem a visit. Willem's sparsely furnished room was on the 4th floor in a private home. He gathered both Nolly and me into a bear hug and then ran to the window. I swallowed the last bit of cream bun, wiped my hands on the back of my skirt, and stood up. Willem introduced Nolly and me around, but when it came to Carol, Carol interrupted. "We know each other already," he bowed ever so slightly. "Do you remember? We met at a party at your home." I glanced from Carol to Nolly, but no, he was looking straight at me. My heart poured out a rapturous reply, but my mouth was still filled with sticky remains of bun, and it never reached my lips. Soon the young men were seated at our feet on the floor, all talking eagerly and at once. Perched beside me on the bed, Nolly joined in as naturally as though visiting a university was an everyday event for us. For one thing, she looked the part. At 18, she was already in long skirts, while I was acutely conscious of the 6 inches of thick black schoolgirl stockings between the hem of my dress and the top of my shoes. Also, Nolly had things to talk about. The year before, she had started normal school. She didn't really want to be a teacher, but in those days, universities did not offer scholarships to girls, and normal schools were inexpensive. And so she chattered easily and knowledgeably about things of interest to students. This new theory of relativity by a man called Einstein, and whether Admiral Perry would really reach the North Pole. "And you, Corrie, will you go on to be a teacher too?" Sitting on the floor at my feet, Carol was smiling at me. I felt a blush rise beneath my high collar. "Next year, he persisted. "This is your final year in secondary school, isn't it?" "Yes, no, I'll stay home with Mama and Tante Anna." It came out so short and flat. Why did I say so little when I wanted to say so very much? That spring, I finished school and took over the work of the household. It had always been planned that I would do this, but now there was an added reason. Tante Bep had tuberculosis. The disease was regarded as incurable. The only known treatment was rest at a sanitarium, and that was only for the rich. And so for many months, Tante Bep lay in her little closet of a room, coughing away her life. To keep down the risk of infection, only Tante Anna went in or out. Around the clock, she nursed her older sister, many nights getting no sleep at all, and so the cooking and washing and cleaning for the family fell to me. I loved the work, and except for Tante Bep, would have been completely happy. But over everything lay the shadow, not only the illness, but her whole disgruntled and disappointed life. Often I would catch a glimpse inside when I handed in a tray or Tante Anna passed one out. There were a few pathetic mementos of 30 years in other people's homes. Perfume bottles, empty many years, because well-bred families always gave the governess perfume for Christmas. Some faded daguerreotypes of children who by now must have children and grandchildren of their own. Then the door would shut, but I would linger in that narrow passage under the eaves, yearning to say something, to heal something, wanting to love her better. I spoke once about my feelings to Mama. She too was more and more often in bed. Always before, when pain from the gallstones had got too bad, she had an operation. But a small stroke after the last one made further surgery impossible. And many days, making up a tray for Tanti Bep, I carried one upstairs for Mama also. This time when I brought in her lunch, she was writing letters. When Mama wasn't supplying the neighborhood with caps and baby dresses from her flying needles, she was composing cheery messages for shut-ins all over Harlem. The fact that she herself had been shut in much of her life never seemed to occur to her. "Here's a poor man, Corrie," she cried as I came in, "who's been cooped up in a single room for 3 years. Just think, shut away from the sky." I glanced out Mama's single window at the brick wall 3 feet away. "Mama," I said as I set the tray on the bed and sat down beside it, "can't we do something for Tanti Bep? I mean, isn't it sad that she has to spend her last days here when she hates it instead of where she was so happy? The Wallers or someplace." Mama laid down her pen and looked at me. "Corrie," she said at last, "Bep has been just as happy here with us, no more or no less than she was anywhere else." I stared at her, not understanding. "Do you know when she started praising the Wallers so highly," Mama went on, "the day she left them? As long as she was there, she had nothing but complaints. The Wallers couldn't compare with the Van Hooks, where she'd been before, but at the Van Hooks, she'd actually been miserable. Happiness isn't something that depends on our surroundings, Corrie. It's something we make inside ourselves." Tanti Bep's death affected her sisters in characteristic fashion. Mama and Tanti Anna redoubled their cooking and sewing for the needy in the neighborhood, as though realizing how brief was anyone's lifetime of service. As for Tanti Hans, her own particular specter moved very close. "My own sister," she would exclaim at odd moments of the day. "Why, it might as well have been me." A year or so after Tanti Bep's death, a new doctor took over Dr. Blinker's house calls. The new man's name was Jan van Veen, and with him came his young sister and nurse, Tini van Veen. With him also came a new gadget for taking blood pressure. We had no idea what this meant, but everyone in the household submitted to having a strip of cloth wrapped around his arm and air pumped into it. Tanti Hans, who loved medical paraphernalia of every kind, took a tremendous fancy to the new doctor, and from then on consulted him as often as her finances would permit. And so it was Dr. Van Veen, a couple of years later, who first discovered that Tanti Hans had diabetes. In those days, this was a death sentence as surely as tuberculosis had been. For days, the household was numb with the shock of it. After all these years of fearing even the idea, here was the dread thing itself. Tanti Hans went straight to bed on hearing the news. But inaction went poorly with her vigorous personality, and one morning, to everyone's surprise, she appeared for breakfast in the dining room precisely at 8:10, with the announcement that doctors were often wrong. "All these tests and tubes," said Tanti Hans. "Who believed in them implicitly? What did they really prove?" And from then on, she threw herself more forcefully than ever into writing, speaking, forming clubs, and launching projects. Holland in 1914, like the rest of Europe, was mobilizing for war, and the streets of Haarlem were suddenly filled with young men in uniform. From her windows overlooking Barthelehorststraat, Tanti Hans watched them idling by, gazing aimlessly into the shop windows, most of them young, penniless, and lonesome. And she conceived the idea of a soldier's center. It was a novel idea for its day, and Tanti Hans threw all the passion of her nature into it. The horse-drawn trolley on the, sorry guys, I don't know how to pronounce that, so Barthelehorststraat had recently been replaced with a big new electric one, but it still squealed to a stop, spitting sparks from rails and wire when Tanti Hans stood imperiously before the Behe. She would sweep aboard, her long black skirts in one hand, in the other a list of the well-to-do ladies who were about to become patronesses of the new venture. Only those of us who knew her best were aware, beneath all the activity, of the monstrous fear that drove her on. And meanwhile, her disease posed financial problems. Each week, a fresh test had to be made to determine the sugar content of her blood, and this was a complicated and expensive process requiring either Dr. Van Veen or his sister to come to the house. At last, Tinny Van Veen taught me to run the weekly test myself. There were several strips involved, the most crucial being to heat the final compound to exactly the right temperature. It was hard to make the old coal-burning range in our dark kitchen do anything very precisely, but I finally learned how, and from then on, each Friday mixed the chemicals and conducted the test myself. If the mixture remained clear when heated, all was well. It was only if it turned black that I was to notify Dr. Van Veen. It was that spring that Willem came home for his final holiday before ordination. He had graduated from the university 2 years before and was now in his last months of theological school. One warm evening during his visit, we were all sitting around the dining room table. Father, with 30 watches spread out before him, was making in a little notebook in his precise, beautiful script, 2 seconds lost, 5 seconds gained, while Wilhelm read aloud from a history of Dutch Reformation. All at once, the bell in the alley rang. Outside the dining room window, a mirror faced the alley door so that we could see who was there before going down to open it. I glanced into it and sprang up from the table. "Corrie," said Betsy reprovingly, "your skirt." I could never remember that I was wearing long skirts now, and Betsy spent many evenings mending the rips I put them in them when I moved too fast. Now I took all 5 steps in a bound, for at the door, a bouquet of daffodils in her hand, was Tinny Van Veen. Whether it was the soft spring night that put it in my mind or Wilhelm's dramatic pulpit-trained voice, I suddenly knew that the meeting of these two people had to be a very special moment. "For your mother," Tinny said, holding out the flowers as I opened the door. "I hope she's—" No, you carry the flowers. You look beautiful with them." And without even taking her coat, I pushed the startled girl up the stairs ahead of me. I prodded her through the dining room door, almost treading on her heels to see Willem's reaction. I knew exactly how it would be. My life was lived just then in romantic novels. I borrowed them from the library in English, Dutch, and German, often reading ones I liked in all 3 languages, and I had played this scene where a hero meets heroine 1,000 times. Willem rose slowly to his feet, his eyes never leaving Tinny's. Father stood up too. "Miss Van Veen," Father said in his old-fashioned manner, "allow me to present to you our son Willem. Willem, this is the young lady of whose talent and kindness you have heard us speak." I doubt if either one heard the introduction. They were staring at each other as though there were not another soul in the room or the world.